Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session on intended use statements. Exciting. I'm Will Sanders, your moderator for this session, and it's great to have you all with us. How's everyone feeling? You guys can drop in the chat how you guys are all feeling right now. You can let us know if you've had a good time with us so far. Elizabeth with the thumbs up. Me too. Also feeling like the thumbs up today. Laura, good to see you. All right, everybody's kind of filling in here. Great. So I'll just introduce myself first. A little bit about me. I am a medical device guru at Greenlight Guru, who in a previous life was a biomedical engineer with roles in product development, quality engineering at small and medium-sized med device companies. I've worked with products like radiotherapy implants, eye imaging devices, RF tissue stimulation devices. And at Greenlight, I love continuing to learn about all the different products that exist all over the medical device world. uh, it's really nice being able to work with the industry so closely. It's really inspiring seeing teams across the world creatively rise to the challenge of improving quality of life for patients, no matter the issue. So thank you all for being here. And a quick reminder to our Greenlight customers: we'd love to hear your feedback. Please leave a testimonial using the link in the chat, which I will drop right now. So that link is for leaving the testimonial. The first 10 to leave a video testimonial will receive a Greenlight Guru swag box as a token of our appreciation. Um, Keep being active in the chat to win that awesome top contributor award. Remember to be respectful and patient with everyone. If you have any questions for our speaker, by the way, please use the Q&A tab to the right of the chat there to submit them on the right side of your screen. And if you want a demo of our QMS or EDC solutions, use the green button at the top of the screen and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Adnan Ashfaq, the founder and director at Simplemedica. He'll be guiding us through the intricacies of intended use statements and their crucial role in the regulatory journey. Adnan brings a wealth of knowledge and experience in this area. And without further ado, Adnan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Will. Thanks very much for the introduction. And I'd also like to extend my thanks and gratitude to Greenlight Guru for giving me this platform and this opportunity to speak about a subject which really is close to my heart. But before I go into that, I'll just give you a quick introduction just about myself. Also, I've been in the medical devices sector for over 25 years now. I graduated in manufacturing engineering, so I come from a production engineering bias. Most people in the regulatory space are either scientists or engineers. I happen to be the latter. And with a manufacturing bias, it also really helps me to understand the production and the level of consistency that's needed in manufacturing medical devices, which are inherently going to be used in patients. That could be yourselves, it could be your beloved family members, friends and family, it could be anyone that you're close to. And the first thing that I was taught when I came into the medical devices industry, and that was going back 1999, was to when you have any involvement in the production of medical devices, think of it as being used on your own family and how you would want it to be used. So that build in quality right from the beginning, take care and everything that you do. So the journey that I've been on over the last 25 years has taken me from being a manufacturing engineer, having a heavy involvement in validation, specifically process validation, equipment validation for the first 10 or so years. I then moved over into quality, then moved further into regulatory. So it's kind of pushing me away from the shop floor, but having that level and grounding and understanding of what was always close to my heart as a manufacturing engineer and understanding the requirements for that. So I'm going to speak to you about the intended use. the beginning and the end of the regulatory journey, and hopefully you'll see in a few minutes why I say it's the beginning and the end of the regulatory journey. So I'm just going to try and use this. Hang on a second. Right. So what we're going to be looking at is, let's look at the medical device definition, because without a medical device definition, we don't even know whether we're actually entering into the whole sphere of intended use. We have to make sure that the device that we're looking at is in fact a medical device. We'll have a look at that. We'll then go into the intended use itself, but I also go into the intended purpose, indications for use, instructions for use. So these are terms which have huge overlaps, and it's very important that we unpack some of these terms, the definitions, and so forth. And then the last thing that I'll look at, which is going to probably dominate the majority of the session, is actually writing an intended use statement, and doing that by looking at examples. And the most important thing is that the intended use statement is actually a culmination of everything above. So this slide that I'm showing here is a development of a new product, and most of you will be familiar with something similar to this, which has maybe 4, 5, or 6 different phases or stages of the life cycle of the development of a new product. And you may or may not be able to see, but the intended use statement is just at the bottom here, and it's right at the beginning of the initiation, opportunity, and risk analysis, where you've got other activities taking place, including patenting your device, having a regulatory and risk assessment and a clinical pathway right up front. And that's all done way before you go into your prototyping. It's very important that we understand the intended use starts right at the beginning of the journey, and it's something that we need to keep a check of constantly right through the journey, right through to post-market. And even after post-market, the cycle keeps continuing, because we have to make sure that nothing's changed in the intended use and the intended purpose. And I'll come on to this in a few seconds, because one of the things that we find very often is that our sales and marketing colleagues are very keen on getting devices commercialized and putting information in the public domain, which may have nothing to do with the intended use of the device. And guess what? That gets us into huge amounts of trouble. The regulatory authorities will be looking at information that's in the public domain. Any published material, anything that you may put on a website, anything on brochures, anything that's any literary information that could be in the hands of the public, the users, the patients, the clinicians, that then goes back to the intended use, which feeds into the instructions for use. And we'll have a look at this in a bit more detail now. So first and foremost, the intended use of a medical device. So very often we say it's a general purpose of the device or its function. In short terms, the intended use often gets mentioned as the purpose. That's the key the word that we want to be looking at here, the purpose of the device or the function. But the intended use may also branch into other things like the indications for use, the instructions for use, which are all interlinked. You know, we've been saying this is completely interlinked. Now, we also need to have a look at the device, as I mentioned earlier, the definition of a medical device. And the World Health Organization defines it as follow, as an article, and medical device is an article, instrument, apparatus, or machine that is used in the prevention, diagnosis, or treatment of illness or disease, or for detecting, measuring, restoring, correcting, or modifying the structure or function of the body for some health purpose. Now that's quite high level. In my view, that's quite high level. And we'll start having a look at the definitions from the EU and the FDA in a second, and you'll start to see the differences. But here are some examples of these medical devices. And there's no argument that these are not medical devices. By this definition, these are all medical devices. So by the FDA, the US FDA defined a medical device in section 201, bracket H, bracket 1. as the following. I'm not going to read out the whole thing, but the first paragraph, which states an instrument, apparatus, implement, machine, contrivance, implant, in vitro reagent, or other similar or related article, including a component, part, or accessory, which is, and it goes on about the pharmacopoeia, the US pharmacopoeia, any supplement, and then again, the intended use for the diagnosis, right, and so forth. And then it also mentions in the last paragraph here, and does not achieve its primary intended purpose through chemical action. So it's now going into the realms of, if it has a chemical action in the body of the man, which is dependent on medicalized or primary intended purposes. So that kind of takes us away from a medical device and could be more for pharmaceutical. The term device does not include software functions excluded pursuant to section 520. But so we'll kind of look at this high level. We now look towards the EU definition, which I'll be completely honest and frank, I'm more familiar with EU regulations. So the EU definition for a medical device is, as we mentioned earlier, so you'll see lots of correlation. Any instrument, apparatus, appliance, software, implant, reagent, material, or other article intended by the manufacturer to be used alone or in combination for human beings for one or more of the following specific purposes. Now, bullet points: diagnosis, prevention, monitoring, prediction, prognosis, treatment, or alleviation of disease. And then diagnosis, monitoring, treatment, alleviation, or compensation of any injury or disability, and so forth. I'm not going to go through again the whole thing in detail, because the underlying point that I want to make here is that the medical device definitions are all coming back to the intended purpose, right? So it talks about the intended purpose. If the intended purpose of the legal manufacturer didn't sound like a medical device, and it didn't come under this category, and it didn't fit the definition of either of these, it was neither of these, it's not a medical device. The intended purpose is not intended for any of these things which make it a medical device. So this is really important that we get past this first hurdle of understanding that the medical device, or the device itself, is a medical device. Let's move forward, because in the intention of its use, the purpose, it has or fulfills some of the earlier definition requirements. So we then move on to, what does the US FDA say actually about intended use? So it says here that the intended use is the general purpose of the device or its function. This includes the indications for use. Now, this is interesting, because when I was given the title originally by my friends here at Greenlight, it was kind of more indications for use versus intended use. But I'm kind of looking at this in a slightly different fashion. And that's because the indications for use becomes part of the intended use statement. So I'm looking at it much broader, and you'll see it'll become much clearer in the following slides. And it says here that the statement of the indications for use for the 510K, so is when you submit a 510K, should include specific indications, clinical settings, define the target population, anatomical sites, be consistent with labeling, advertising, and instruction for use. So back to my point about the marketing, our sales and marketing friends, because it can be easy to get carried away with some of the materials, and we say that our device can claim to give you the best aesthetics or whatever else, it does all this, but does it really do that? Do you have any claims, evidence that you can back that up by? And we'll come on, because what I want to do is I want to correlate some of these, the development of the life cycle of the device, and look at where the intended purpose and use and these terms overlap and hit on some of the verification and validation activities. So furthermore, looking at the intended use definition from the EU MDR 2017-745, the EU MDR refers to the intended use and user around 31 times, to mention in different ways it mentions it. And in the EU IVDR, it mentions the intended use and the user of a medical device 38 times. So it's really important that we're actually looking at the regulation of what the regulation is telling us. So the EU MDR says within the intended purpose, which is mentioned this number of times according to the regulation, the definition of the intended purpose is the use for which a device is intended according to the data supplied by the manufacturer on the label and instructions for use, or in promotional or sales materials or statements, and as specified by the manufacturer in the clinical evaluation. Now you'll see there's similarities between what the US FDA had, but here they've also mentioned that what's specified by the manufacturer in the clinical evaluation, because in the clinical evaluation we will make claims which is also based on the intended use, and we have to back that up by evidence. So the key points here is ensuring that the device meets safety and performance requirements in accordance with its intended purpose, and then also conducting a clinical evaluation of any literature relating to that also has to be related to the intended purpose of the device. So now let's have a look at the instructions for use according to the MDR. So the instructions for use is defined as the information provided by the manufacturer to inform the user of a device's intended purpose and proper use, and of any precautions to be taken. So now we're kind of stretching this out a little bit more, because it's now going to the user. We've now gone from the space where we've defined it internally amongst ourselves as developers of the device, and now it's going to the user. The instructions for use is user facing, and therefore it has to have what the intended purpose is and what the proper use is, what precautions, contraindications. We put all of that information in the instructions for use. So the key points here is that the device should be accompanied by the required instructions for use, that the CE mark must also appear on the instructions for use, and that the manufacturer should identify and test measures to safely dispose of the device after use. And these procedures should be explained in the instructions for use, and also a list of requirements for the instructions for use of the device. So these are all elements of the instructions for use, but it always comes back to the intended use and the intended purpose. Now, I don't want to miss out the UK regulations. The UK regulations also have a definition of the intended purpose, which states the use for which the device is intended according to the data supplied by the manufacturer, the labeling in the instruction and or in promotional materials. Again, very similar to the EU MDR, which, as most of us will know, the UK regulations is the old 9342 EC directives, which has been adopted in the United Kingdom. The instructions for use then is defined as the clinical condition that is to be diagnosed, prevented, monitored, treated, alleviated, compensated for, replaced, modified, or controlled by the medical device. It should be distinguished from the intended purpose, intended use. So that's interesting, because it's already saying that discussion that we had was the indications for use versus the intended use. It's already differentiating that they should be distinguished. And this is why it's important to not only think about the indications for use and the intended use, but look at it almost as an entire package. And that's what I'm calling the intended use statement. So the key elements of an intended purpose are that you have a structure and the function of the device, the intended population, intended user, in the intended user environment. And then it also then goes on to say that the intended purpose statement should provide an understanding of the appropriate state of the art, the product risk level, and the evidence required to demonstrate the safety of the product. And inappropriate intended purpose statement can lead to non-compliance with the law and possible safety concerns. So these are, you can see it's all coming back to risk. And this is why I've put up here ISO 14971. And some people may or may not be familiar, but clause 5.2 in ISO 14971 actually gives us some really interesting almost hidden notes, because people miss this. The number of times I've actually had to point many of my clients towards ISO 14971, and there's a note under 5.2 which mentions some of this information that should be included in the intended use, which states that the manufacturer shall include the intended use of the particular medical device being considered. And then it also then goes on. This is taken verbatim from ISO 14971, that the intended use should take into account information such as intended medical indication, patient population, part of the body or type of tissue interacted with, user profile, use environment, and operating principle. And then also the manufacturer shall also document reasonably foreseeable misuse. So and then another really important two other points here, the notes here which it mentions here further on, is related to our usability specification also. So usability requirements 62366. That's all about usability engineering, human factors. How is the device going to be used? So again, the intended use here is also very important. And then 24971, this is a tool that you can actually use to develop your intended use, because there's lots of questions that get asked in the Annex A of 24971, which will help you draft your intended purpose and make sure that you're on the right lines. Some of the type of things that it asks is, what is the intended use and how is the medical device to be used? And then below that, it then goes on and it mentions a number of factors that you should consider. And then it basically takes the definitions of the medical device that we've looked at. What is the medical device's role relative to? Is it diagnosing, preventing, monitoring, treatment, all that stuff, right? And then it goes on. Annex A is quite long. Is the medical device intended to be implanted? Is the medical device intended to be in contact with patient or other persons? Is energy delivered from the patient or substance delivered to be extracted, etc., etc.? So therefore, we also have to have a look at Annex A. We've got very limited time, so I'm going to be scrolling through this fairly quickly. So we don't have the benefit of looking at this in great detail, but also, again, ISO 13485 mentions intended use 15 times in the ISO. We also have to look at when we're looking at design and development, which is why one of the very first slides I showed you was the development life cycle. So now we're getting on to the meat and the substance of where we're at, right? So because what I want to do in this latter part of this session is look at and flesh out the intended use statement. So everything that we've looked at prior to this slide, we looked at the medical purpose. We needed to look at user population, and that included age, weight, sex, health condition, the specimen, what kind of input you've got into the device, user profile, training, experience, what level of training experience is needed, application, the environment where it's going to be used, the frequency of use, is it single, is it reusable, location, is it going to be in a home or is it going to be in a clinical environment, mobility, is it portable, or is it going to be installed? We need to look at that's all part of your intended use statement. And then the foreseeable misuse, look at Annex A and look at the questions that are being asked there. And then finally, the clinical claims. As we've already seen, the evidence earlier points towards us looking at clinical evaluation, looking at the clinical claims, and tying it in with the intended use statement. Right, so what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to break down all of these A to G and give you some examples so it becomes a bit more meaningful. So the medical purpose, as we've seen earlier on, it defines that the product is indeed a medical device, and it follows a definition of the relative jurisdiction for use. So whether that's the US or UK or Europe or wherever else, any other geographical location, we have to look at that medical device. You know, we shouldn't ignore it's those are the three big areas, but also if we look at the Chinese definition, we'll look at Brazil, Canada, we may want to have a look at Australia, depending on where you're looking to commercialize. Always look at the regulations from that locality, from that jurisdiction, and just ensure that it's in line with the same definition and it's not something which catches you out, because it may well look at something other than what we've looked at. But those are the areas that we've looked at: the US, Europe, and UK. All right, so moving on now. So let's have a look at some examples. Right, so some of the examples that I'm going to have a look at is we'll look at a device which is portable, is disposable, it's to be used in the home or non-clinical setting. It can be also used in a clinical setting, but that would be a COVID-19 rapid test kit. Most of us are familiar with that from a user perspective since the recent pandemic. And then also a mechanical ventilator, which on the other hand, would not be used in a home environment, but it would be in a hospital environment. Now, the intended use, intended purpose in the intended use statement will look slightly different as we go through each of these, because then we start looking at the user population, the age, the weight, the sex, the health condition. And the important thing to look at is, and this is why I wanted to correlate the intended use with all of the other activities on your development lifecycle, because these factors are going to then feed into usability studies. Human factors is going to also feed into your product requirement specification, your clinical studies evaluation, your product design validation. If you change any one of these in your intended use statement, you're going to have to revise or review each one of these activities. That could happen any time during the life cycle of the device. It could be even post-market. When the device is already being used, it could be used in a home environment, but you now want to use it in a clinical environment, vice versa. So do we have evidence that we've tested it in the alternative or the other environment, which was not in the original submission? We then need to have a look at this. So this is why this is really important. So this is just going on to look at some examples now. So for example, where it becomes relatively important is in a COVID-19 rapid test kit for age. Test kits need to be usable by a wide range, including elderly individuals and children. Weight is generally less relevant, but it should be easy to be used with people with also physical disabilities, not just capabilities, but also sex should be user-friendly for all genders. Health condition, it should be use design, which is the health conditions, people with arthritis that can't grip the device very easily. And there should be clear instructions for people with cognitive impairments. These are things to think about. But where would you then test that? Clinical trials. Testing should include a number of range of for weight, for different sex-specific issues or variances. Trials should also look at various health conditions. We look at chronic illnesses. What is the device's claim? If it's literally COVID-19, then that's the claim. We need to back that up by evidence that it could find those microbes, right? If it was something else, like influenza or meningitis or something else, it's got to look for those other malaria or some other bacteria. It's going to try and find that. So then this goes back to the intended use. Like on the other hand, if we have a mechanical ventilator, we also have some examples here, which is a fixed device in a clinical setting. You have to have a look at age again. You look at weight, sex, and health condition. Right, so specimen, like moving on to specimen. So the specimen, the input is going to also impact the design verification. Your specifications have to be written. Your product requirements are also going to be driven by what you detail in your intended use for specimen. And this will be things like, if we carry over the same example of the COVID-19 test kit, we're going to have a look for the presence of SARS-CoV-2 virus, right? So then we're going to look at the design verification for accuracy of testing. We need to look at reagent and sample stability, contamination control. The specification needs to be drawn up, and that will be drawn up with technical parameters, safety specifications, storage and stability. People are thinking, what's this got to do with the intended use? Well, this has got everything to do with intended use. And you can look at this through the tree that I've just illustrated here. The mechanical ventilator may not have a specimen. There's no biological specimen, but it requires natural breathing. So that could be the specimen. So the natural breathing is not compromised. So then we move on, going back to the tree that I showed earlier on. We've got to element D now. We're now looking at user profile. The user profile training experience can then also, that feeds into your usability and human factors, also into your instructions for use, any training that's needed, and also clinical evaluation. So then the example that we've given by the COVID-19 rapid test kit would be It's used by laypersons. In the usability human factors, we need to be able to prove that it's easy to use, that the instructions are comprehensive, that they're accurate, and that it gives user confidence. That the instructions for use itself, that provides clear, concise, and easy to understand instructions that guide the user through the test process. Now, we would have seen, many of us would have seen lots of illustrations and symbols, which is user-friendly. So it's also, it cuts out the requirement for language, where there's lots of language translations that need to be done in international countries. If it's being done, it's universally understood. You've got symbols which are, but that has to be validated. Those symbols have to be tested to make sure that they indeed don't fall into any risk by somebody misunderstanding one of the visual symbols. Instructions for use. Training. What type of training is needed? Online tutorials. Maybe we don't need any for the rapid test kit. Maybe the instructions for use is enough. And then the clinical evaluation, or the performance evaluation, as we would call it in the IVD sector, would also then look at other user profiles, and we then have to make sure that there is enough data that validates the safety and the efficacy of the device. All again goes back to the intended use. And on the other hand, the mechanical ventilator, this is not used in the home environment by laypersons, it's used by healthcare professionals. But again, we still see that usability, human factors, instructions for use, training, and clinical evaluation, again, are all impacted. And we need to make sure that we've done the level of testing, we've done stress testing, we've validated the right number of samples statistically on the number of users that gives us valid data, the instructions for use, the manuals, any emergency protocols that are used, and any training. Again, if it's hands-on, whether it's certified programs, online, that's all going to be validated as well. So within the clinical evaluation, we'll look at possibility of clinical trials. What are the claims that we're making? Are they based on predicate devices? Are these devices that have already been in the market and used for, X number of years? And there's so much data and published literature that we can utilize the published literature, and we don't have to do the clinical trials, because nobody wants to do clinical trials. Of course, face it, the clinical trials is a very expensive, long, and cumbersome process. So we want to try and see if there are any other predicate devices. Now, one of the things that I'll mention, just kind of off slide deck, is interestingly, especially with startups, if you draft an intended use and an intended use statement with all the bells and whistles, and you have all the claims that you would wish to have, but then there's no predicate device, there's no equivalent device, and you don't want to do clinical trials, then we're in a situation. So very often, my advice under those circumstances is to rein back, pull back your claims, pull back and simplify your intended use and intended purpose. Make the statement simple. Get your foot in the door. If you've got a device that's already a predicate, if you have no experience with medical devices, it can be very overwhelming to get involved in medical devices, and try to do things the simpler way, the easier path to regulatory conformance. Once you've achieved regulatory conformance, and that could be through a 510K, it might be through self-declaration in Europe or the UK, and you have some experience of doing that, you can then use very much the same content for then submitting a file to a higher classification with higher claims, with more bells and whistles added to it. So it's doing it on a stage-by-stage strategic process. So that's often my advice. So returning back to the slide deck, so section E of the intended use, we look at the application, the environment, the frequency of use, the location, the mobility. Again, as I've mentioned, the environment. So what is it? Is it in a home environment, or is it clinical, or both? So then we need to do some validation tests. We have to make sure that it can indeed be used in those environments, and we have got some evidence of trials that it's okay to use them in those environments. So the frequency of use, if it's single use, is it disposable? How do we dispose of it? That's environment friendly. And remember, risk management is not just about harm to people, but it's also harm to environment, right? So we have to make sure that we have all those risks identified and then use the correct language on the instructions for use that also tells us the correct disposal of the device. So sterile, non-sterile, right? If it's sterile, again, we've got to use all the correct symbols on it. But we would have mentioned that in the intended use, that this device is indeed actually a sterile device or a non-sterile device. Is it implantable or non-implantable? If it's software, is it going to be installed? Is it cloud-based? Is it to be used at home or clinical? If the device is portable or if it's fixed. If it's fixed, it needs installation. Now, bearing in mind, we also have to have a look at our quality management system. So in our QMS, if we didn't have a procedure for installation, we have a problem. We need to make sure that we have an SOP or a procedure that also in our QMS has installation. Because maybe we had in our quality manual made a non-application against ISO 13485 and said that the device that we are manufacturing is actually never going to be installed. It may be a cloud-based software, so there's no installation, or we could have said that it's non-sterile, but there may be some sterile components which you're buying in that you're not CE marking yourself, but you buy it in, but the overall device then contains a sterile swab or a sterile component. So therefore, your device and your quality management system also has to make sure that it's equipped for that intended purpose and intended use. Okay, so looking at some of the examples for the rapid test kit, so the environment, so it should function effectively in diverse environments. So temperature, humidity, cleanliness, these are possible key considerations. I don't have, or maybe I do somewhere, but I don't want to rummage through my drawers to find a COVID-19 test kit. But I think it possibly mentioned something about room temperature or temperature or humidity, but the cleanliness that the test should be taken in. When you open up the swab and you use that as a nasal swab and you take the sample and you follow through the instructions for use, the environment, that's a key thing. The frequency of use, the kit should be designed for single use. So, I mean, suddenly if the test kit says that it can be used multiple times, does it? Can it? Maybe it's not the ones I was using, but maybe it's a different type of test kit, and things have been kind of advancing in technology. But then disposal. If you have disposable components, and you also have to make sure you're preventing cross-contamination. You've got clear disposal instructions, location, where is it to be used? So again, is it in a home environment, in an office? That's key considerations, because if you're in a home environment, how clean do you keep your home versus a clinical environment, which you would expect to be pretty clean, versus a home or an office environment where there's lots of people coming in and out. So these are important factors to take into consideration. And then also the portability, where you're doing the test, etc. The mobility of it, it's portable, robust, ease of use on the go. Right? These are some of the things that, if you remember when all these devices were coming out, there were lots and lots of claims being made. Many of these devices went through the emergency use authorization. They didn't have this level of rigor or scrutiny, but you'd expect legal manufacturers to take the care that they need to, as if it was being regulated by the authorities. So the mechanical ventilator example, on the other hand, would similarly look at the same factors, but in a different way. Key considerations for a mechanical ventilator would be, again, temperature and humidity, but also electrical interference, cleanliness and sterilization. So this is, you wouldn't expect a mechanical ventilator to be used in a home environment. It's not necessarily been designed with that in mind. So this is really important at the outset when the intended use statement is being drafted, that all these key characteristics and considerations are being made, and then that you understand the repercussions of changing any of these branches of the intended use statement. The location, the key consideration is the ventilator size, where would fit in operating rooms, emergency departments, intensive care units. Controls and displays should be easily accessible, should be legible, installed in the hospital settings, which is not portable. So these are all key considerations, again, to have a look at. Foreseeable misuse. So we've been talking about ISO 24971. And the good thing about this also is that when you start looking at the risks at the early stage, it forces you to start looking at the risk analysis, or at least think about the worst case scenario. Are we looking at death, or is it inconvenience, or something, just fairly minor or superficial that could go wrong with the device, depending on what the device is. If it's a class 1, 2, or class 3 device, if it's a class 3 device, it could be an implantable device. That could be pretty serious if something goes wrong with it, as opposed to something which is a class 1, which could be a surgical glove or a surgical instrument, which might be a class 1, disposable, never to be used again. So again, if you look at 24971, you look at some of the questions that are being asked, it's asking all the right questions, especially if you've never done this before, and you want to know and navigate to make sure that you've done this right in the outset. It's asking some really interesting questions. Are there essential consumables or accessories associated with the medical device? Is maintenance and calibration necessary? Does the device allow access to information? Does the device store data critical to patient care? Are there any delayed or long-term use effects? These are things from Annex A 24971, which we need to consider. So I'm going to try and move a bit faster. We've got the last few slides in a few minutes. Right, so as an example, with the COVID-19 rapid test kit, what could go wrong? Misuse scenarios. Users might use the test kit components incorrectly, mixing up vials, leading to inaccurate results. Users might incorrectly collect or handle the samples, resulting in insufficient or contaminated samples. Users might skip steps or misinterpret the instructions, such as not waiting the correct amount of time for the test results to develop. Users might store the test kit in inappropriate conditions, such as extreme temperatures or humidity levels. So what do we then need to do as mitigations? These are some of the mitigations that we would do at the earlier stages of the design and development stage, that we would make sure that to prevent incorrect use or mix-up, we would have clearly labeled test components with instructions with clear illustrations. To make sure that the users are correctly handling the samples, there also must be clear guidance in sample collection, including training materials such as online tutorials. To prevent users skipping the instructions or misinterpreting the instructions, we have to make sure that they're user-friendly, that they're designed well enough, that they're clear, they're unambiguous in language, and they have visual aids. Like I mentioned earlier, some of these instructions for use don't have, or very, very minimal language. It's all kind of pictorial. Users might store the test kit in an appropriate condition, so including temperature and humidity indicators or warnings on the packaging, necessary. Design packaging to protect the kit from environmental factors. These are all design validation activities, which all stem from the intended use. So on the mechanical ventilator, I just want to make sure that we're looking at both scenarios. We have also got mitigations here and misuse from a mechanical ventilator. Inadvertently set incorrect tidal volumes or pressures. Users might incorrectly connect the ventilator tubing. Users might ignore or fail to respond. These are all things that you would typically do in, you might call it clinical FMEA or a risk assessment, whichever you're using as a tool, a fault tree analysis, but all of the user-related failures would be flagged up. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to flesh out something which would be a user flow diagram. And this is very often what I would expect to see is a user flow diagram. And that user flow diagram is, right, I've opened up the intended use state, the instructions for use. And the instructions for use tell me, open up the packaging. Step 1. Step 2, remove the device from its packaging. Step 3, present the sterile packaging to a scrub nurse. Step 4, remove the device from within, etc., etc. So all I'm trying to do is give you a very logical way of putting down the failures that might end up coming from a user because they're incorrectly using the instructions for use, which all comes back and stems from the intended use statement. Right. Lastly, the clinical claims, which will drive from your clinical evaluation studies. So it will drive rather than it will come from. It will drive because whatever you put in your clinical claims, and that should be done up front in the intended use statement. If we say that we claim that we're going to alleviate osteoarthritis, or we're going to claim that this device will reduce mental health issues or some sort of disabilities, it will alleviate the following, or it will monitor the following, it will predict the following. These are all things that we say quite flippantly, but these are claims and they have to be based on evidence which is validated. And sometimes we find this in marketing material, or very often we'll find it in marketing material, but also the root and the source of it should come from the intended use statement. So these are claims from a rapid 19, so the COVID-19 test kit, you would have 95% sensitivity, 98% specificity. We make these claims. The rapid test kit performs reliably across different age groups and demographics. The rapid test kit is suitable for 12 months when stored at room temperature. But did we validate all of these points? We've got to make sure that we're validating them. And that would be done in clinical studies, shelf life, usability, it's all going to be tested. In the same way with the ventilator example, we will also make claims, and we also have to make sure that these are validated claims. So finally, I'm just going to wrap up here. In summary, the intended use is the foundation for all decisions, and a sufficiently clear intended use is key to meeting various aspects of the medical device regulations effectively. So when clearly defined, the intended use will, number one, determine if the product is indeed a medical device, and will also help you classify the device. Is it class 1? Is it 2? Is it 3? Is it implantable? Well, it's not. But if it's implantable, it pretty much wouldn't be a class 1. So we can kind of dodge that. So all these things, when we think about this carefully, and we write a good statement, we're ensuring that we've covered our grounds, and then aligning the design process, especially in terms of usability, because the usability crops throughout the development lifecycle of the device, and ensuring that the clinical development plan aligns to your business development plans, your regulatory plans, your device design and development, and then also any quality assurance plans. And then don't forget your quality management system. If you end up saying something in your intended use which wasn't covered by your ISO certificate, could be in the installation, the servicing, or any one of those other clauses. Sterility, for example, we've got 3 or 4 clauses in ISO 13485 to do with sterility. We've got a problem, if we say that these are non-applications, but they are applications because your device is sterile, we've got to make sure we've got that correct as well. And then also providing key information for labeling, instructions, clinical evaluation, technical documentation, and then finally, promotional materials. Our friends, sales and marketing, we love you. We want to sell the device. We have to make claims, but make sure they're backed up by clinical evidence. So that's me wrapping up. So I'll hand it back over to Will. It's been very exciting to share this information with you.
Thank you, Adnan. I just want to say thank you for such an in-depth, comprehensive presentation on intended use statements. I know I learned a lot of good information from this that I'll be taking with me into my day-to-day job. And it looks like we have received quite a few questions from the audience. So let's go ahead and dive into a brief Q&A session here. And I will start with Pamela here. has a question that I will share. Do lawyers write the intended use document to protect against off-label liabilities? What do you
Right.
think about that?
That's a really good question. Right. Okay. So I do have a problem sometimes, and I've run into a few issues with lawyers writing documents from the regulations, because I mean, when it boils down to it, what's the regulation? The regulation is a legal document, so lawyers like to chip in. However, what I would also like to say is that if the lawyers don't have any industry experience and they've had no real experience with writing any of the documents and facing the regulatory authorities, we have an issue. You know, there's a problem. There's been instances where I've had a legal team which has come, you know, almost straight out of college, university, and they're really good at looking at the regulations and understanding and interpreting them from the way they understand, but with no industry experience. That's catastrophical, because industry experience here is paramount. Industry experience, when you've been round the block and you've done this and done that, you've seen this and you've seen that, that is invaluable. You know, so it's really important to, if you're using lawyers to write intended use statements or any other document for that matter within the regulatory submission, make sure that they actually have industry experience, because there's a lot of lawyers there that are charging a lot of money, and unfortunately they're giving incorrect steer towards the regulatory requirements without that background information, the background knowledge and experience. I'm not sure if that answers your question. I mean, you talk about against off-label liabilities, but the off-label liabilities also have to come back to your risk management, because your risk management will look at any risks which are off-label, but they have to be, and we have to make sure that when we look at risk management, it is within the boundaries of reasonably foreseeable misuse. Those are the key terms, because off-label sometimes can go way out there, which is not reasonable, it's not foreseeable. And that's why anything that we look at has to be reasonably foreseeable. This is why when you have industry experience, you'll very often in your risk management also involve clinicians who have that real world experience, and they'll be able to tell you what really is likely to happen, what's reasonably foreseeable, what's off-label. So this is why just the word of caution is making sure that you've got experience and you've got the right people experienced. Clinicians are key.
Yes. And I would say that a lot of that factors into your ISO 14971 activities, where you look at probability of occurrence and things like that. All that comes together. Great question. Great answer. Thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and move to the next question here from Philip. This has more to do with AI here. This is some more questions about ChatGPT that I saw in the chat as well. But this one says, any comment on using ChatGPT or similar for writing intended use or indications for use statements?
I know, mind-blowing question. Well, the thing is that we're all tempted to use ChatGPT, and it's kind of a novel technology that's out there. We want to kind of play around with it and see what comes up. And I'm not hiding any fact that I've kind of delved into it and looked at it, and it's mind-blowing, you know, what can come back. But again, you know, having that human element and making sure that you're cross-checking with those people with the right experience, and you know, an indications for use. What ChatGPT probably will do is it will scour the internet and find similar devices from a question that you might pose it, and it will come back with some sets of information, and you will then delve in more and delve in more and delve in more, and you will kind of get something that will look like an intended use statement. But fine, let's say that you started off with that, but then make sure that you can in fact validate all of the statements that's come back by ChatGPT. Can you really verify and validate those statements? Because if it's all a bit fluffy and kind of woolly and sounds nice, it's all kind of a marketing spiel, we've got to be really careful, because you have to be able to validate that. And that's going to come through all of the things I mentioned in this presentation. So it's a dangerous thing to do. It's a bit risky, but then you're still going to have that human verification, human validation after it's spun out whatever it comes up with.
Great answer. Great question. Very relevant for today. The general space technology space that we're kind of living in nowadays. So great question. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today. Big thank you to everyone for joining us and contributing to this discussion. Special thanks to Adnan for sharing all this expertise with us. We're all going to take it with us. And thank you so much. Don't forget to join us for our next session on how to prepare for common MDR audit pitfalls. And looking forward to see you guys all there. Take care.
Thanks, Ken. Thank you. Bye-bye.